Hello, everybody. Welcome back. So, today we're going to talk about the Manhattan Project of Consciousness and the making of the love bomb, kind of its hypothetical history. Essentially, it's a very interesting topic. It's a very interesting topic today. I wrote in 2016 a little kind of like essay on speculating what the Manhattan Project of Consciousness would look like if it was successful. First of all, I definitely want to mention that I understand if people have an aesthetic distaste for the concept of a Manhattan Project of Consciousness. It feels like you're, kind of like um, allocating a lot of beneficial status to what was essentially gathering a bunch of super smart people to create the deadliest weapon we have as a species, which is absolutely terrible, right? Like it's really evil in a way that, like, whenever we've actually gathered a bunch of geniuses in the desert in the past, something like an atomic bomb is what comes out of it. So I totally understand that. And in fact, I also understand that it might be kind of unsettling to think of large-scale project about consciousness because, yeah, what if, like, it's used for bad purposes? I completely understand if you're nervous about it. However, let me make briefly the case for why actually thinking about this does make quite a bit of sense and is not necessarily just bad taste, in my opinion. Actually, it is very generative. It is very thought-provoking to think along these lines. Well, but before I go there, the qualia of the day actually is Burning Man qualia. I mean, we're approaching Burning Man. The reason I'm probably not going to go again, I mean, I might go once or twice again. It would be like very, very carefully selected years. It is because of the dust. I mean, the dust does seem to be pretty bad looking if you look at pictures of electron microscope. Analysis of the playa dust. It's probably something that stays in your lungs, maybe indefinitely, for all your life. So I actually anticipate kind of a linear, cumulative, lifelong damage to your lungs. And yeah, there might be long-term side effects for that reason. I know people who've gone 20 years and they've developed a cough. Their respiratory system seems to have taken a hit. And I've gone twice. It's been incredible. It was life-changing twice, like both times. It was really incredible. I mean, I'm here for the long game. So I'm all for kind of like doing things that have a lot of benefit early on, and then maybe tapers down, and then the damage accumulates, slowly over many things. For example, something like MDMA, right? Like MDMA taken a few times is probably quite safe for most people, except, you're genetically predisposed to maybe excessive neurotoxicity or you're a poor metabolizer. There's like exceptions, but in general, a few MDMA experiences, probably pretty harmless. But 100? 200? Yeah, well, A, it stops working, and B, it does cause depersonalization, heart issues, depression, anxiety. It makes your perceptual filters be set on a slightly less friendly setting, essentially. So just as, on MDMA, everything looks extra friendly, extra welcoming, on the post effects over the course of several weeks afterwards, like subtly less friendly, subtly less welcoming, that accumulates, especially with repeated doses. The same, I think, something like Burning Man. But what's relevant about Burning Man is that it is absolutely one case where you get to see how incredible it can actually be to take a bunch of nerds into the desert and have them essentially have kind of a consciousness party, ultimately, right? Psychedelics and empathogens and mind altering, all of that goes hand in hand with Burning Man. Not everybody who goes to Burning Man takes psychedelics, but a majority of people do. It is actually very highly concentrated when it comes to like really interesting people. For example, the first year I stayed at both the years I stayed at Camp Soft Landing, which is actually, yeah, where a lot of the OG psychedelic people stay. I was like randomly chatting with people about, hey, could we test something like valence structuralist, the theories of consciousness? And the person I I just happened, to be talking to said like, oh yeah, I've done some very relevant research and you should look into this and this researcher. And it turns out he was actually one of the members of the Yale Psychedelic Society or the Yale Psychedelic Research Group. And yeah, people like that. I mean, like original researchers. Yeah, Sasha Shulgin gave a talk at that camp, and quite an incredible event. You really get to see this kind of a phase transition when you gather. Yeah, a lot of people very into art, a lot of very technical people. Most people are university educated, like solid, like 20-30% have like graduate degrees, and very conscientious people. People who get stuff done. The last thing I will say is that Burning Man is also a little bit of an exercise in equanimity. Like, if you know the amount of labor that will be involved, especially if you're, playing a leadership role at a camp, for example. Yeah, if you know, if you have a sense, hey, you will be working a lot during that week. And also partying a lot, but, you will have to be moving a lot of stuff. You will need moving furniture equanimity and unpacking equanimity and putting things together equanimity and having a cold in the middle of the week equanimity and not enough sleep equanimity and not being able to sleep in the morning because it's very hot equanimity and thirst equanimity. And if you have that, then it's a glorious, glorious event. Otherwise, yeah, no, it's also a source of, a lot of people break up at Burning Man. A lot of people get psychologically injured at Burning Man. So it's yeah, if you have the equanimity, it's beautiful. But anyway, regional burns, QRI parties and gatherings, there's other things, similar vibe, maybe not as much work, similar concentration of super interesting people, maybe even higher, and coming near you, hopefully soon. Okay, so a little bit to kind of like greasing the wheels for, okay, what happens when you put a bunch of like really smart people in the desert together for a purpose other than, maximize death and destruction and deterrence power and super violence, right? Like ultra violence, right? Like that's like, imagine if we weren't working on that, right? And well, here's the thing. The Manhattan Project of Consciousness, I have a conception of it, it's not arbitrary. There's a little bit the problem that if the slogan is used by organizations, by researchers already, it will be kind of used as a way to redirect more resources to whatever they're doing already. Like there's a little bit of that tendency. But I actually would say, no. Hold on. There are actually really big opportunities and actually some significant non-trivial analogies that we can draw to the actual Manhattan Project Manhattan Project when it comes to analogizing it for consciousness. And it's more than just, hey, let's all work together on a very difficult problem for a short period of time that will transform the world. Right? Like we can find a tighter analogy that I think makes us see it in a much more ambitious way. So I will mention a few things. Well, the first thing I will mention is, okay, like LSD actually was discovered in 1943 while, the Second World War was raging. Imagine if actually, instead of figuring out how to build a bomb, right, it was how do you actually get the optimal LSD experience that shows you that we're all one consciousness and that we ought to love each other. Like, yes, that happens sometimes on LSD, but not always, right? So what are the ideal circumstances where that happens? That is the sort of thing that, yes, a project, very smart people working together to optimize it could definitely make big breakthroughs. And, okay, so here are some analogies. We will go deeper into them, but here are some analogies. So first of all, a very non-trivial, honestly, really kind of mind-blowing and technically beautiful thing about the Manhattan Project of Consciousness that is not talked about in the movie Oppenheimer, but it will be talked about on any documentary that you see about the Manhattan Project, is, the technical challenge of actually compressing a uranium core fast enough and, efficiently enough that you actually get a fission chain reaction that, lasts long enough to actually be capable of unleashing most of the nuclear material being used. So essentially, you need to literally compress what would be thought of as an incompressible solid, right? But, high explosive shock waves are really powerful, you guys. A high explosive shock wave can compress an incompressible material by a certain percentage. And I asked the ChatGPT, and he told me that the precise percentage is probably a nuclear secret, and I could get into trouble probably if I were to provide technical details. I'm not going to do that, out of an abundance of caution. But the point is, you actually do compress it by a significant percent, right? It's not like a 1% compression. It's like a lot more. And and to do that, you need a shock wave that is extremely symmetrical. Actually, you need a spherical shock wave that it causes an implosion. Here's the thing, though. If you just put a bunch of explosives in a spherical arrangement and you detonate them at the same time, the actual explosive wave, the actual high explosive shock wave, will originate out of the detonation points and grow in a spherical fashion. And so actually, by the time it meets the center, it's going to be kind of this intersection of circles. It's going to be this very irregular shape, and you're not going to be compressing the material homogeneously. And also, the material will be able to actually be squeezed. It's going to be squeezed, and that prevents it from actually staying long enough at a close enough, super highly compressed state for the full chain reaction. So the technical solution is explosive lensing. This is a mind-blowing thing, that essentially the shock wave of explosives goes at different speed as a function of the material. And so you can actually use two different materials. This is not secret. This is very cursory Wikipedia reading. Essentially not sharing anything I think is dangerous. It's just, very surface reading. But essentially, the combination of two explosive materials at their interface, depending on the particular mathematical shape, something like a paraboloid or a ellipse, or a particular conic function, it will essentially function as a lens for the shock wave. And so the precise shape that they used, suggested by John von Neumann, actually, and based on some of other work that he had been doing, essentially is capable of creating this actual perfectly spherical shock wave that compresses the material homogeneously. We will see in a moment how that connects to consciousness. There's actually a very non-trivial, very significant connection here. The second way in which this actually might be quite relevant is, oh my goodness, actually, especially for the development of the hydrogen bomb, computing architectures. The von Neumann computer architecture, which is essentially an ancestor of all of the modern computing systems, was created in order to produce simulations of essentially how to make a fusion bomb, that contains both a fission component as a kind of spark and a bunch of mirrors to concentrate radiation and essentially cause a fusion reaction in a different location within the bomb. That actually required very advanced numerical simulations that it was just too difficult to do by hand. So they needed something to accelerate it. It really comes down to things like, numerical methods. Like, for example, the Monte Carlo sampling method was developed also for the fusion bomb. Monte Carlo is not actually who made it, who came up with the algorithm. Actually, it was Ullem. If you've ever looked into nuclear weapons, you will know the Ullem-Teller design. So Ullem was a very, very key figure. And he came up with the Monte Carlo method. And why is it called Monte Carlo? It is because that is the name of the casino that his uncle used to frequent. So actually there's no Monte Carlo in this story. It's one of those funny funny stories for how something got named. But eventually, computing, the computing revolution came out of the Manhattan Project and von Neumann and Ullem's work and Teller's work. That is anyway, like the sort of thing that makes me think of is that to some extent, big breakthroughs in technologies sometimes I think do require this high concentration of geniuses put together to the task with a deadline. and well, in this case, yeah, there are amazing applications, obviously very scary applications, but potentially without something like the Manhattan Project, without these like super geniuses out there that could be recruited, I think it's possible humans might not have developed, a computing architecture that is capable of doing the things that we now are able to do, right? Like, if we were just a little bit less intelligent and we had a little bit fewer kind of super outliers, then yeah, maybe we wouldn't have computers. In the same way, the sort of breakthroughs that I anticipate out of a Manhattan Project of consciousness might very well be in the same category. That if you don't actually have kind of this pressure cooker of super smart, and in this case, highly benevolent, highly driven individuals, there are some breakthroughs that would potentially just never happen. Another thing is, the optimizing mindset is like, well, it's not only about just the explosives. It has to be perfect. It has to be seamlessly symmetrical. That kind of like mindset also might apply to the Manhattan Project of Consciousness. And, also just kind of like the whole concept that the recruiting process actually required kind of these like seed of people, somebody like Oppenheimer to be able to recognize talent and bring it together and find out who works well with whom, rather than, just throwing a bunch of resources together. Because, yeah, if you don't have those like, nucleation points with high discernment for what kind of, cognitive architecture do we need? What kind of person do we need for this problem? Then it also wouldn't work. So all of those are kind of, like lessons or parallels when it comes to the Manhattan Project of Consciousness. Now, what would the Manhattan Project of Consciousness be pointed to? Remember the title of the talk? The Making of the Love Bomb. Now, love bomb, unfortunately, as a concept, is somewhat taken as kind of this. I think there was a classified research project by the U.S. For how to essentially make soldiers instantly homosexual and have them like be so horny that they're like making out with each other, and then you would be like disabling your enemy that way. That is not what I'm talking about at all. Actually, that is just the same old aesthetic of war, right? And domination and violence and control applied to, how do you use some of these beautiful feelings for that purpose? And that is still very much the opposite of what I think, the healing counterpart to the Manhattan Project of Manhattan Projects would be. The healing counterpart would essentially be figuring out how to stabilize these extraordinarily beautiful, pretty much selfless, but in some sense transcendent states of loving ecstasy that exist. They're phases of consciousness. We know they exist. How do we stabilize them? How do we make them happen reliably? Like that 1 in 1,000 LSD trip where people say, I only experience pure consciousness and God all throughout. And, they're glowing, and it clearly did something really profound and very clean to their consciousness and nervous system. How do we get that? How do we hone in on that? What kind of precise, precision engineering do we need to make that happen? The love bomb. Well, okay, actually there are some like relatively trivial, relatively, accessible paradigms and parallels here. So first of all, criticality, right? Well, the whole, Robin Carhart-Harris, the entropic brain hypothesis, where psychedelics are kind of these like high energy, entropic, high entropy configurations that break down, pre-existing patterns of stress and canalized patterns. Their criticality shows up because criticality essentially means, every change, how many other changes is it going to produce? And so when like that number is less than 1, essentially when you cause a change into system, yes, it may cascade a little bit, but then it dies down. When the number is exactly 1, then statistically you get a wave that continues to move, but it doesn't grow. And then when it's like over 1, you actually get a chain reaction. You get like a growing activity. I am quite serious in suggesting that psychedelic states of consciousness actually have something along the lines of thresholds and of phase transitions where a critical mass of some sort is reached, and then you have a chain reaction. What would be, what do I mean by critical mass and what do I mean by chain reaction? Well, it's not actually going to be something like, fissionable material, like nuclear material or anything of the sort. It's going to be, again, looking back to QRI paradigms, algorithmic reductions, which is essentially a conceptual framework to make sense of exotic states of consciousness, where we identify a few basic effects such that their synergy might explain the zoo of perceptual features that arise. In this case, we can get something that looks like a chain reaction by just combining two elements. The first one is tracer effects, essentially things just lingering. Qualia lasts longer. You move your hand around and you see copies of your hand lingering in your visual field. The same with like thoughts and feelings and emotions and tactile sensations and even flavors. Everything on acid lasts longer in a dose-dependent way. We've looked at this at QRI with a tracer tool, kind of like the tracer length as a function of the dose and so on. It's very nonlinear. It takes kind of a threshold dose for you to start experiencing tracers. And then there's like another dose where like the tracers start to become really, really freaking pronounced. Okay, so that's number one. The second one is drifting. Essentially, the chunks of your phenomenal space start to break down and they start to wobble and rearrange themselves in a way that minimizes the essentially free energy of the visual system in that case. But it's also like perceptual space more broadly. That also is dose dependent, and there's kind of a threshold, and then there's like another level where it starts to become very pronounced. And the concept by Shenzhen Yang of flow, essentially, if you don't know what flow is, and you just took 300 micrograms of LSD, you will know very soon. You're about to figure out what flow is. Yeah, essentially this drifting kind of almost kind of the consciousness tectonic plates is one way of thinking about it. Those two things combined actually synergize profoundly, and I think they produce very nonlinear effects where essentially, sorry for saying essentially so much, one of the pieces of feedback I've gotten recently, you get this feedback process, essentially the qualia lasts longer, plus you're getting some jittering effects, some drifting effects, and then those essentially cause turbulence in the feedback process, and so you're adding this turbulence to the feedback, and you get an emergent turbulence and criticality, and like a very intense generation of lots of complexity. So yeah, the same on DMT, for example, above like 10-12 milligrams or something like that, you start having these nonlinear interactions between the various effects that then boom, and is a kind of chain reaction, very related to criticality. So that is another non-trivial connection here, useful for kind of ideation, and we'll get to that in a second. Next is, well, here I'm fully agnostic. I assign low probability to this hypothesis class, but it is worth discussing as a possibility, especially because it's very commonly reported, but essentially, when you have a gathering of people really into music and on the right combination of psychedelics and empathogens, there is the feeling of a group mind that arises. Now, the strong interpretation is that there is actually some kind of topological pocket of the electromagnetic field that gets generated with a group. I think it's possible. I mean, because it feels like that. It's really extraordinary. Now, what is the right combination? So this is the case of Evan McMullen, who a friend of mine, and you can see his talks on the Stoa. He has an amazing series on intersubjective parasites and and memetics. Brilliant guy, a really, really awesome dude. When you talk to him, he has a lot of ideas in general. Very, very worth pinging. He has seen a lot of parties involving, a rock band, psychedelic rock, and essentially just like gatherings of hundreds of people in linear combinations of LSD and MDMA primarily, and some ketamine as well. But essentially, if you have approximately 30% of the participants on LSD and around like 30% on MDMA or 20% on MDMA, and then a solid 40% candy flipping, and then a few sober people and maybe a few people on ketamine, kind of like approximately that distribution. And well, cannabis apparently also helps, but especially the LSD and MDMA together. Yeah, the MDMA produces this sense of embodied collective, and then the LSD energizes it and creates activates the resonant modes of whatever that crazy topological pocket is. That's what it feels like. If you're in the middle of it, it's very difficult to know actually who you are. Like there's a very deep loss of sense of self, but rather than not knowing who you are in the sense of like, I don't know who I am in infinite consciousness, is more kind of, I don't know who I am within this group. Of course, yeah, the LSD dose cannot be too high either. There's kind of a sweet spot, maybe 200 micrograms or something like that, 150. And there cannot be too much ketamine, because actually that slows down this kind of collective sense of, unified consciousness across a lot of people. It slows it down too much and breaks the synchrony with the music, but a little bit is okay. And all of this makes me think of electrical circuits and modulating, electromagnetic properties and antennas. It's like, hey, what kind of electric properties in this nervous system would generate this kind of collective wave behavior? Again, there is, of course, the, materialistic, cynical interpretation that all of this is just happening in your mind. And yes, there is some kind of like maybe resonance that happens, but it's completely mediated by the body language and maybe the shared stimuli. There's nothing actually happening in the field in addition to just people syncing up through body language. That's also possible, in which case, yes, it would still be sociologically interesting to study, of course, but it would, take away the sense of the potential for something actually even much more transcendent here, much more powerful, which is something like a critical mass at the collective level in order to catalyze a phase transition in consciousness more broadly. Kind of like as if Burning Man itself was a pressure cooker that was concentrating, for example, the special people who can become critical, and then have them as kind of a container to, rather than when the criticality happens, it's in the wild, and so it gets messed with and interact with and coupled with regular people out in the world, and just that doesn't generate chain reaction. But maybe the night of the burn, with a sufficient actual conscious pressure and container, there the criticality might be contained, and then you might generate a chain reaction. That sort of thing is what starts to come to your mind if you take seriously the possibility of, okay, actually, hold on a second, maybe there is some non-weak version of group coherence in these psychedelic events. I'm open to it. Again, low probability, but hey, it's worth speculating on. But I mean, that is not really what I think, the high probability, high yield potential for the Manhattan Project of Consciousness is. So if it is not that, then what is it? Then what is it? So I think of it as when you have a truly successful psychedelic experience or a meditation experience, when you actually achieve a jhana, it's also, I think there's a critical mass component to it, or like an analogy to it. Or you have a really wonderful candy flipping experience, or whatever, LSD and nitrous. Like there's specific combinations, and I'll explain why I think actually the combinations sometimes do these. Sometimes you experience a phase transition that feels like if everybody could experience this and stabilize it, it would be essentially the end of the human experiment, as it were, because it's just a quality of consciousness that comes with a sense of benevolence and intelligence and groundedness and essentially lack of self-bias that is potentially world transforming. Not to oversell it, but there is definitely that feeling, and it doesn't happen every time. It's a very sensitive thing. It's very sensitive to initial conditions, very difficult to make it happen reliably. But some people can, after years of dedication and years of practice. So I think here, kind of the chain reaction that we're thinking of producing in a way wouldn't be really something that is for the sake of just releasing a lot of energy, just for the sake of an explosion. It would be for the sake of a phase transition in consciousness towards configurations of matter and energy that are strictly on another level of the valence dot consciousness equation. Essentially, you're going to be trying to maximize that equation, the consciousness multiplied by positive valence or net valence, configurations of matter and energy that maximize that. And there are some really interesting gems in the state space of consciousness that seem to do that. Now, MDMA states of consciousness, for example, could be thought of as a stepping stone. So in the original article, I actually thought of as a modular architecture for the Manhattan Project of Consciousness, where we would have essentially people that specialize in computing and computing architectures and computing paradigms. Then you have like physicists, you also have meditators and psychonauts. You also have, like interdisciplinary thinkers and philosophers, but all of them, actually quite technically minded and capable of conversing with a broader team. And with kind of like this specialized modular architecture, the idea was to kind of like create a series of long-term interventions that drastically change the texture of consciousness. One of them being essentially something like MDMA, but MDMA like coffee. MDMA you could drink every day and it keeps working just the same. Or then the second kind of like more advanced in a way phase transition to look into would be 5-MeO-DMT. In particular, the combination of extremely positive valence when the trip is good and the quote-unquote realization or deeply felt sense of the reality of the oneness of everything. Now, these two things are not arbitrarily chosen. The reason why I think they're so significant is that, as I see it, the cure to essentially our problems having to do with, war, ultimately, and mutual destruction, is that we have deeply embedded dualistic assumptions about the nature of reality in how we form alliances, in how we conspire with each other, so that it is always, in a sense, our group must be the survivors if bad things happen. This assignment of infinite value to your experience relative to a random other experience. These two ingredients might change that. So first of all, MDMA, like states of consciousness that are sustainable. And again, like if you take MDMA for the first time, it is almost like you're giving birth to a form of consciousness that has that beautiful, innate sense of love towards anybody. Very intense loving kindness. But it is kind of like a baby form of it. Now, imagine if you could cultivate that for like hours every day sustainably and never stopped feeling that good and beautiful. Then it is like you would be maturing that state. So I really don't think, you would be, have no chance in the ecosystem of game theory, in game theoretical ecosystem, because you would be essentially kind of like a cooperator bot and people would take advantage of you. Like, sure, maybe the first few days, but then you adapt, but still you have this very massive prior that it essentially is allowing you to spend most of your cognitive resources on identifying massively positive sum games, as opposed to worrying, spending most of your cognitive cycles on in what way am I going to get screwed, which it's important. But if you do that all the time, as it is the typical default of the human baseline in general, with exceptions, of course. But in that case, you're going to be essentially unlocking cognition for a much broader set of potential games to play that I think might essentially give rise to super cooperation. You do require actually a protective shell. I mean, if you have a company that is made of people who are like constantly in an MDMA-like state of consciousness, they might be super cooperators themselves, and actually the products that they make could potentially be super, amazingly efficient because they're not concerned about credit as much. There's a lot less politics. I estimate that something like 80% of a company's cognitive resources gets directed to internal politics. It's very depressing. I mean, and that's that's informed based on having read thousands of performance reviews and engagement surveys in a past life when I used to do natural language processing for that sort of thing as a full-time job. Yeah, I mean, it's very rare for companies not to have internal politic issues. I think in principle, with kind of like a constant MDMA-like state of consciousness with very smart people in a way that it has matured, I think that could be lowered to maybe 10%, 5%. I would expect nonlinear returns in this and a critical mass effect. So again, yeah, kind of like some metaphors with the Manhattan Project are actually in place. The other thing that this does is it completely demolishes this postmodern intuition that essentially value is completely arbitrary or relative. That once you understand that there are these beautiful, soft, feathery, loving textures of consciousness and they're computationally significant, the idea that it is something unique to your culture or unique to your history, that like the reason you like it is because of your Western mindset or something like that, that completely falls away. Actually, you like it because that is part of the intrinsic nature of consciousness. It actually prefers the feeling of being whole, as opposed to our typical everyday hungry ghost consciousness of always needing 50% more, right? Like if you could actually feel satisfied in the profound love that you're experiencing every day, it in some sense it solves kind of the challenges that come with a excessively postmodernist perspective on value itself. And then the second phase transition having to do with something like 5-MeO, DMT, ego-less consciousness, well, oh my goodness, then it becomes undeniably rational that a sufficiently actually holistically intelligent organism ought to, in some sense, actually care about the well-being of consciousness itself. Essentially, the welfare of the universal field of consciousness becomes the obvious thing to work on because you realize that it is you. Not in a cheesy, metaphorical, low-grade way, but in the hard ontological, deep truth sense of the concept. And so with those two things, I think, again, if the people who actually understood this were precisely, Fermi and von Neumann and Teller and, Feynman and people like that, honestly, that could be a phase transition in consciousness, extremely significant. Okay, so let me say a little bit more about the specifics here. There's a lot I'm not going to share. I would only share with a close collaborator. But there are some high-level kind of insights here. So I have talked before about the brain as a nonlinear optical computer, which is the current QRI lens or framework to make sense of what is going on in the nervous system. We literally think that various substances and various states of consciousness can be so radically different because they're actually modulating low-level electric and magnetic properties of, for example, the brain tissue. I mean, when a neuron fires, for example, it briefly, significantly increases the conductivity of whatever part of the neuron is actually firing. In principle, I think that once you start seeing the brain as essentially a patchwork of local field potentials being modulated by neural activity, really, you're actually modulating an optical system. You're modulating patterns of electromagnetic resonance and hooking them together and creating fields where wave equations apply. And when you see it this way, in fact, and this is something I'm going to expand much more on, but in fact, you have things such as lensing effects, One example of these is LSD and nitrous oxide. So LSD kind of like works as a very generic, powerful energizer of consciousness. We estimate at around like 15 to 20 hertz, at least in the visual field. You get this flickering, replay, strobe effect, according to our tracer tool. And essentially that energizes all of your consciousness. Essentially, we think that the actual hallucinations that you experience and the changes in consciousness are downstream of this energization process. So you're kind of like looking at how the nervous system behaves when you're very highly energizing a particular region of it with a particular frequency. Now, what nitrous oxide and dissociatives more broadly does, according to our model, is it slows down the speed of wave propagation. Now, these in low doses is kind of a mild effect, but in high doses, something like nitrous or ketamine, can be really profound, because by slowing down the speed of wave propagation, and I'm assuming that is essentially waves in the local field potentials, the patches of local field potentials, you can get a decoupling between the predictive processing hierarchy and the waves that are being used to render the features of your experience. So at low doses, that may jam a little bit. It may it may be like lag behind a little bit. So your experience might be a little bit wobbly and like out of phase. Yeah, that is because, your neurons are finely tuned for a particular speed of wave propagation in the field. And now with ketamine, I would predict actually that those waves are traveling a little bit slower. Increasingly slower as you increase the dose. And eventually it's sufficiently slow that it actually becomes fully decoupled from the predictive processing hierarchy. And literally what you're experiencing on high doses ketamine or nitrous oxide is the natural resonant modes of a nervous system where waves travel more slowly, which are different resonant modes. Essentially, the metaphor is with the Cialdini plates, these metallic plates that vibrate at specific frequencies, and you can see the resonant frequencies, sprinkling sand on it and seeing the nodal regions. If you were to add molasses to it, the waves would travel more slowly. And that essentially entails different resonant modes. The actual shapes are going to be different for a particular frequency because the waves travel more slowly. So if there's a lot of hardware that kind of depends on, is assuming a particular speed for wave propagation for computation, then there's going to be ultimately, at first lag behind and be a little bit out of sync, but in higher doses is actually be fully decoupled. Okay, so you're already highly energized on LSD, and then you take nitrous oxide. The nitrous oxide doesn't hit your nervous system all at once. It actually depends on what parts of your nervous system get the oxygenated blood first, the blood with nitrous oxide in this case. And so if you pay attention, if you're like in 2 hits of LSD, let's say, and you take a full, actually if you take a little bit of nitrous oxide, let's say like kind of like a little layer, you will experience the weirdest thing, which is this expanding shell on your world simulation where waves are traveling more slowly. Meaning that you're not actually kind of suffusing the nitrous oxide in a homogeneous wave, but it's kind of this bolus. And typically it is actually going to start from your sense of self and expand outwards towards, and it finally hits the horizon. That's crazy. I've never seen that reported, but I'm pretty confident it happens. The moment it hits your horizon, actually, you get this kind of like ricochet back of waves that, because now all of that actually is decoupled from the predictive processing hierarchy, it kind of functions as a lens for these waves of sensations, waves of awareness and attention. And so you can actually, by timing the nitrous oxide and playing with a particular combination of oxygen, the dose, the proportions, you can essentially create what is described in physics, in optics, as a gradient index optics, which is where there is a smooth transition between two materials with different index of refraction. And so the light actually travels in a curved way. So I think that using nitrous oxide in a precise way actually allows for these waves of sensations to coalesce and do things like a spherical implosion. And when that happens, it is like a nuclear bomb is exploding in your consciousness. And at the place where you have the implosion, sometimes you get a complete phase transition towards this much more mystical and crazy state of consciousness. So yeah, I mean, explosive lensing and qualia lensing, there's a parallel there. Now the question is, how do you precisely time these waves so that they actually come in a, in a way that will highly energize a very, very tiny nucleation point, but do it in such a way that it produces a beautiful, symmetrical, lattice-like phase transition of consciousness that feels wonderful. Because presumably you could do this wrong. And this is actually one reason why I might hesitate making this video. Is just like, well, if you don't time it right, you might have like a very bad experience. So don't do this at home, kids. Leave it to the professionals. Leave it to the people who are gonna be doing the Manhattan Project for Consciousness whenever that happens. Because you could have a bad time. There are reports of people having pretty bad experiences combining nitrous and LSD, and I think it has to do with things such as like what are the vibes of that particular implosion when it does happen. And of course, if you're doing it randomly, it's unlikely it's going to be that precise, right? It's much more like, if you're actually trying to do something, then you can mess up pretty badly. So important to mention. So lensing effects, the symmetry theory of valence by Mike Johnson, and then there's development, things such as the consonance, dissonance, and noise characteristics of these waves, I think are essentially what gives rise to the valence of the state and the quality of that phase transition. Now, what does a successful phase transition feel like? And here, in the broadest sense, we would be talking about the exploration of a very large state space. I mean, understanding how to do 5-MeO-DMT properly so that you get this kind of implosion effect in the best way possible. Or how to do, what I would actually consider generalized candy flipping. I'm going to make a whole video about candy flipping. But, I mean, essentially, I think optimal candy flipping actually looks more like combining MDMA and LSD and 2CB and ketamine, in very precise ways, in a staggered way, smoothly exchanging one substance for another. I'm going to talk a lot more about how to do that properly, if there is a proper way of doing it, or at least a research proposal for how to actually do good research on candy flipping, which is currently very disappointing, what has been put out there in academia, what is published. I think, the science does not understand candy flipping at all at this point in time. But optimal candy flipping would actually involve really a careful simulation of these lensing effects in your world simulation. How to actually create waves that have beautiful envelopes and are highly consonant. Okay, so when you have, in the best scenario, like the best candy flipping experience, the best LSD and nitrous oxide, the best 5-MeO-DMT experience possible, these phase transitions that I consider gems in the state space of consciousness are things that, for lack of a better term, feel full of open individualism. There's a sense of understanding that everything is one. That is a component of the texture of this phase of consciousness. Second is this feeling of togetherness, mysterious, it's wondrous. There's harmony, there's love, there's selflessness, purity, light. It feels like a dance. There's euphoric, wobbling. Is delightful. Actually, this term of like interbeing. So the reason this is not just lights out, perfectly smooth, completely lacking in consciousness. I'm not talking about a cessation, although I think that's also a kind of implosion, worth talking about it as well. Cessations are going to be really relevant, actually, for understanding enlightenment, which is like moments where like you completely blank out, and the moment right after it tends to be really healing and beautiful. Not necessarily talking about that. Actually, that might minimize consciousness. I'm actually talking about maximizing the equation, which would give you essentially the maximum consciousness times valence, net valence. So you get like the most intense but also blissful experience possible, where you're maximizing how much well-being, how much pleasure, how much love you're experiencing. And that, I'm pretty convinced, actually is not just perfect symmetry. It's something else. It is love. Phenomenal love. And phenomenal love is exactly in this, triple point, this Goldilocks zone of oneness, when it doesn't feel like everything is completely just one, this kind of like cosmic loneliness. It doesn't feel like everybody is their own separate selves, and it doesn't feel like each moment of experience is its own consciousness. It's another thing that combines all those three, and that allows you to actually have this delicious, lovely vibration between subcomponents of you. It's almost kind of like they're just out of phase enough that they're frisky. they vibrate in this way that they're like oscillating around the feeling of oneness without collapsing into oneness. They recognize their shared essential nature, but they maintain their quasi-individuality. I mean, I think that's what MDMA does. That's what 2CB, the euphoric and pathogenic quality of 2CB, does. LSD doesn't do that as much. 5-MeO-DMT, I think it does, especially on lower doses. The lensing effects for phase transitions that I am the most interested in would precisely be when you do put that as the nucleation point, the peak love that you could have. 100% love multiplied by as many as many joules, as much energy as possible, actually as much power as possible. So it's actually a kind of interbeing state of consciousness, a kind of hyper poetry. It's a hyper poetic state of consciousness. I would say it is kind of the state of consciousness where it is like when you're listening to the best part of a song, but you're superimposing on top of that the anticipation of you're about to listen to the best song in the universe, combined simultaneously with the feeling of satisfaction of just having listened to the best song in the universe. All of those three simultaneously. It feels like time is the non-issue. Like there is no attachment, no sense of clinging, no sense of losing positive feelings, because you're kind of experiencing them all at once from a timeless perspective, where there's no fighting or clinging or internal friction. Yeah, I don't know what that is, but it is a radical transformation to the, kind of like network topology of attention and awareness that generates that. And another thing in that space is this difference between the panopticon and the plenopticon. Sounds very technical and very precise. Actually, it is very significant. The panopticon, I suppose Foucault came up with that, is essentially it is kind of like a prison system where you have like a central guard that can see every cell simultaneously and there's no privacy. But not every cell can see every other cell, actually. Neighboring cells, they don't know what they're doing. They can't see each other. So that is a kind of a arrangement of attention and awareness where there's a privileged state, a privileged perspective that can see everything and everything can see it. And that is a kind of supersymmetrical state of consciousness that I associate with essentially God consciousness, the feeling of universal consciousness. But the deeper phase transition that I'm talking about, which is much more connected to, let's say, fourth path or 5-MeO-DMT, is the plenopticon. And the plenopticon is a function in optics that looks at a three-dimensional volume, and on every point in that volume, it tells you how light looks like from every possible direction. So essentially, it is you're essentially multiplying a 3D volume times the 2 sphere, because at every point you can associate a sphere to it. So it's actually a 5-dimensional space. And that whole function is what this space looks like from every point of view simultaneously. My claim is that, that phase transition that I am very concerned with, that I think would be worth looking into as the objective of a Manhattan Project of Consciousness, is precisely one that feels like you have the ability to grasp the plenopticon of the entire state of consciousness. Yeah. I mean, it's very hard to describe. Of course, when you also reduce information content and you have the plenopticon, then that actually may collapse into nothingness. Because of loss of information content. And that could also be extremely blissful. But you can have the plenopticon mixed in with extremely positive love qualia. And then that synergy is, next level next level beauty. It's such a beauty of a state of consciousness. Okay, so now we're getting close to the end of this discussion. There's obviously a lot more to unpack. Is it, for example, would this tell us kind of a revelation about the intrinsic nature of consciousness? So in some ways, I think many of the Buddhist schools, many of these like lineages that promise transformation of consciousness, sometimes they sell you this idea that you will understand the true nature of consciousness. I guess in Buddhism, they talk about the three characteristics. Life is unsatisfying, there's dissatisfaction at the core of existence, there's no self, and there is impermanence. If you were to truly grasp, these realities, then you're truly understanding the nature of reality, the essential nature of reality. I think that's just a recipe. It's just a way of looking at your experience that generates profound transformations, whether or not actually that's metaphysically true. But I do think there are kind of like metaphysical truths that you can infer in the right states of consciousness, such as the paradoxical superposition of wave-like and particle-like properties of consciousness. In these like hyper-coherent plenopticon phase transitions that I'm talking about, a very specific kind of euphoric, blissful ego death sort of experience that maintains a sense of intelligence. From those, I do think you are learning something about the essential nature of consciousness, and it has to do with something like the superposition principle, that the actual state of consciousness is the superposition of all of the perspectives within it at the same time. When you are in that state of consciousness, that is self-evident. And it almost feels like a normal state of consciousness is like taking that superposition of every point of view at once and adding constraints to it until you get weirdly shaped into something that feels more like a human, where you're actually very constrained. But you're still a superposition of every point of view at once. It's just that your shape is very constrained and compactified and lower dimensional along some axis, such that superposition actually feels like the Cartesian theater. It feels like you're a tiny homunculi in kind of this theater of consciousness. But don't be deceived. The screen of consciousness is not fundamental. The thing that is much more fundamental is this superposition of all perspectives at once within your topological pocket. And that becomes self-evident. So there are kind of metaphysical truths to be found with these special gems in the states of consciousness, but they are not obvious or evident, and they're not necessarily the thing that took you there in terms of attitudes or formulas for how to approach and relate to your states of consciousness. Now, the last thing I will cover is, will the hedonium shockwave, presumably, this phase transition in consciousness, in the field of consciousness, is it going to ignite the whole atmosphere? And I'm just going to deflect and say the only thing that's going to ignite the whole atmosphere is my attire at tonight's party at von Neumann's. Being serious here. Yeah, this is a hedonium shockwave. I'm actually tempted to make also a perfume specifically themed about the Manhattan Project of Consciousness. If you have suggestions for what you think that should smell like, I'm all ears. I think it would be fun as kind of a building of the Qualia Research Institute cinematic universe. All of these like fun elements and artifacts. Cultural artifacts, actually. Is it going to ignite the atmosphere? So imagine if it could, right? Like, maybe that is our destiny. I mean, I think we should obviously be very cautious about it. I think the prior is obviously not. I mean, there will be just kind of constrained to your own world simulation. But, it is kind of this like fission versus fusion. Maybe the fission stage of the Manhattan Project of Consciousness could be, how do you get these reliable qualia lensing effects for beautiful, extremely, relaxing, calming, de-traumatizing, deeply rejuvenating, loving phase transitions. But then maybe the fusion stage would be, how do we do that at a grander scale? Either at a collective, like imagine we had like billions of dollars of funding, we could do actually something like Burning Man, except that it is actually much more selective and much more intentional for it actually creating a critical mass of like several thousand people with the proper kind of like exotic individuals inside and kind of, it's a boosted kind of a chain reaction. That could be, and maybe actually you get a phase transition at the level of like topological pockets that are larger than just the individual. That conceivable, unlikely, but conceivable. But then the long-term vision here would be something like, well, if we have a correct theory of valence and you point it at cosmological objects, let's say the sun, Rupert Sheldrake wrote an article about is the sun conscious, and Shamil Chandaria, one of the advisors of QRI, actually helped him with some of the electromagnetic theory of consciousness component there. But essentially, with our topological solution to the boundary problem, we can in principle actually find topological pockets in the sun and quantify its valence. And it may turn out to be that it has a very mixed valence because it's a natural phenomena without evolutionary selection pressures or intelligence that favor, highly blissful states of consciousness. Maybe there are some alterations that you can do to the sun so that it actually, the chain reaction, nuclear chain reaction is one that is blissful, very high valence. So maybe you could organize these plasma tubes and cells and electromagnetic pockets, electromagnetic confinement. You can do that so that the sun sings in a beautiful harmony, very high valence and blissful. And then if we were to point our telescopes to the sky and find suns that have the spectral properties of a harmonized star, then that would be evidence of essentially large-scale cosmological engineering for the purpose of higher valence. Well, for that sort of thing, it may very well be the case that there is a way of arranging matter and energy that will produce literal hedonium out there in outer space. Maybe that is our destiny, right? Maybe that is the big picture teleology if consciousness wins against replicators. And I would be here for that. That would be very sweet. Could also very well be the case that cosmological objects are already really close to optimum. I'm not against that view at all. I think it's possible, but it could also be that the signatures of benevolent superintelligence in the cosmos would be spectral signatures of optimized flow of energy for maximum valence in cosmological objects. I will mention, just to end, that in Los Alamos, when they were building these computers, MANIAC actually was one of the early computers, they also started programming things like, an algorithm to play chess. There is actually a kind of chess that is called Los Alamos chess, a slightly simplified version of chess without bishops, I believe. It's like 6x6. It doesn't have bishops. Los Alamos chess, you had to kind of simplify it a little bit because the computer is not very sophisticated. So if you want to play with it, it's going to be a simpler model. I mean, I think something like that mindset, one of the outcomes, I think, of the Manhattan Project of Consciousness will be a much deeper understanding of qualia computing. I absolutely expect a computing revolution, a paradigm shift in computing once we start understanding how qualia computing works, which I think is a certain kind of like holographic wave, nonlinear wave computing using fields and neural networks at the same time. Well, I'm going to make a video soon about the computational properties of DMT entities, but I am pretty sure that superintelligence in the broadest sense possible will come out of understanding qualia computing and things such as how does a DMT entity copy, mutate, pass around, analyze, differentiate, transform chunks of qualia for making large-scale qualia computing architectures. So likewise, just as the Manhattan Project of the atomic bomb generated the von Neumann computing architecture, I think, the Manhattan Project of Consciousness, studying 5-meo DMT with super geniuses and visual artists and physicists and meditators and so on, I think it's likely will give rise to completely novel computing paradigms using consciousness. And there's a lot to unpack about that. So stay tuned. That's all for today. Infinite bliss, everybody. Thank you for tuning in. Ciao. I hope you have a wonderful, wonderful time. May the hedonium shockwave reach you sooner or later in a beautiful, blissful way. See you later.